to our speaker. Helen Shantal Pike followed her father's footsteps and in 1976 began working as a writer and photographer, starting with a newspaper job for the Asbury Park Press. In the years that followed, she received a master's degree from the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, and in 1991 she started a freelance career, becoming an independent travel writer and photographer, principally for the Boston Herald. Her work has appeared in a wide variety of publications, from the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, the Washington Post, and magazines such as Vermont Life, Northern Woodlands, and New Jersey Monthly. After her father, Robert E. Pike, died in 1997, the Countryman Press, a division of W. W. Norton, negotiated for a new edition of his Northwoods classic, Spiked Boots. She wrote the foreword and supplied never-before-published photos from the Pike archives, including a family snapshot of her dad, his uncle who raised him and to whom the book is dedicated, and herself in the parlor of the Rabbit Hill Inn in Waterford. Helen has written numerous books on New Jersey, including Greetings from New Jersey, a Postcard Tour of the Garden State, which was published by Rutgers University Press. Through it all, she says her longest-running research and writing project is a memoir about her parents. She says, I've tried out various titles, such as Missing Links, after I discovered an overpopulated backstory of 3 wives, 2 stepsons, a second wife. I have a typo here.
It's a work in progress, so don't worry about it.
So is this, apparently. Who put his name on 2 sons' birth certificates, a son raised by another man, and at least 2 women who wanted to be the 4th Mrs., and she herself, the child her mother desperately wanted. In 2012, she moved from the Jersey Shore to the Upper Connecticut River Valley and lives on the water not far from the original village settled by her colonial ancestors. Now, for the first time since 1954, a Pike again lives in Waterford. Helen spoke here last year on the subject of lost Waterford, and it was the biggest crowd we have ever had for one of these lectures. The fire department had to come over and ask some people to move their vehicles. So, to the record-setting speaker, please welcome again Helen Shantal Pike.
Now, we can get started. It was 2 summers ago when Bob gave his pitch about finding people in the community that had something to share with the rest of the community, and it was the handbell ringing choir over in South Church, and I went up to him and proposed what became Lost Waterford. And then last year I proposed a postcard tour because I knew that the Athenaeum had this amazing collection of postcards that upon appointment you have to ask to see them, but that had been donated to the Athenaeum. And so this is supposed to be in April because I'm trying to own April for a variety of reasons, but I had to work. So here we are in August. I appreciate you all coming out, and hopefully this won't last too long and make you too hot, and I will try to talk slowly and not wave my hands around. But as a child, and this is my very first postcard collection, and these are all different views of the state capitals across America from all 50 states. And my father had a friend who was a freelance lecturer, and whenever he was in an airport, he would buy the postcard of that state's capital and send it to me. And so I'm just going to use this because I think that's, going to be a lot easier. And so I learned the state capitals and my geography of America, plus Alaska and Hawaii, from these postcards that came in for about a 10-year period. And my mother bought this little simple photo album. They don't fit because they're too big for the photos. And then she would type up what the state capitals were. And they became like flashcards. And of all the things that could have been lost, this one never was. And I'm really happy that I have it in some sentimental way as a beginning that led to my collecting postcards in a very serious manner. Of course, I started when I was maybe about 5 years old, and I was given a quarter every time we went on vacation. And at that time, a quarter could buy you 5 postcards at 5 cents a piece, or a nickel. And that's something I have a lot in common with Leonard Lauder, who's probably America's most famous postcard collector, who I'm going to talk a little bit about at the end. And so, you know, the views from these postcards are ones that our simple little Kodak square camera couldn't ever capture. You know, if you go to the Grand Canyon, you'll never get those panoramic views because you just don't have that kind of camera to do that with. So, okay, I'm at a loss, but we'll gamely go on, and you'll just have to edit this. I'm really sorry. We'll go back. So I will try to take you through a multi-layered history of what postcard collecting looks like. I won't go into the tall weeds too much, and we'll just get started. No, we won't. We will go forward. So basically, if we're going to draw a line in the sand here in the United States, this is when Congress passed this act, and anything that was privately mailed as a postcard was 2 cents, and a government-issued postcard was 1 cent. So businesses could buy the government postcards at 1 cent and put some kind of advertising message on the front, and it would take a number of years before there'd be legislation that would pass that would change that. At this time in our history in America, mail would be delivered to a central location, a post office, and you would have to go to that post office to pick up your mail. So if you're living in rural America, you didn't have rural free delivery. You had to go to the post office, and maybe once a week. And eventually, in 1863, we had free mail service to people's homes. So the farmer didn't have to go to the local post office unless he wanted to mail something, or he could buy his stamps and then have whoever was delivering the mail pick it up and take it along. And eventually we have a legislation that's passed in which the government decides that there's going to be parity and all postcards are going to be 1 cent. And most people refer to this as the alliterative penny postcards. So, by the time America was, wrestling with this legislation, Europe, particularly Germany and Austria, were cranking out postcards, these beautifully produced postcards, and they were sending them all around Europe. And then Americans who were on the grand tour of Europe would buy these postcards and send them home. And these, obviously, the top one is Venice, the bottom one is from Berlin in Germany. And these were being shipped around to prove you'd been somewhere, that you had extended your life experience by being in a foreign country, visiting a foreign city, and having the grand time of your life on the grand tour of Europe. Now, mail is going back and forth, and about 1876 we have our first centennial exposition, and it's in Philadelphia, and we're 100 years old as a country, and so we're really pretty proud of the fact that we've achieved so much in 100 years. And this is where Alexander Graham Bell introduces the telephone, which is going to change ultimately how mail service gets delivered, because people don't have to deliver mail. If they can afford a telephone, they can just pick it up a phone and call somebody, or call on a party line. But if you couldn't afford a telephone, mail delivery was sometimes 2, and in urban areas 4 times a day. So you could, and I have in my collection, a postcard that's sent out in the morning to somebody inviting them to tea at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At 2 o'clock, the person who's giving this party gets a response from her guests saying who's coming, and at 4 o'clock they all show up, or not, depending on their RSVP on the postcards. So this is a great way to stay in touch. Doesn't really, a penny for a postcard ultimately doesn't really take a whole lot. And there's usually some kind of an image on there, on the front of them. So we leap into the year of 1893. Is a watershed year with regards to the next big exposition that's held, and it's in Chicago, and it's a World's Fair, or as it's sometimes referred to as the Columbian Exposition. And this is a postcard, a commemorative postcard. You know that we do this. In fact, Joan, in East St. Johnsbury last year, when you had the centennial celebration of Old Home Day, you had a special cancellation stamp that the post office put on any postcards or envelopes that people bought for that day. So this is an earlier edition of that kind of artwork that was done, and you could buy this postcard, you could send it, you could put a brief message on the back, to whomever you're sending the postcard to and send it off for a penny. Okay? So what we have going on at the Columbian Exposition is, people are still raving about how great a country we are. And this is from the California exhibit. Now, I love this for probably all the wrong reasons, but it's from, in about 1891, 2 years before this exposition, Santa Clara County, California, produced 20 million pounds of prunes. And so when this exposition came around, they had this horse and knight rider made out of French and silver prunes, which are dark and light colored prunes that are alternating throughout. And then they had candied fruit down at the bottom for the other, non-things. And I love the excess of this view. But here's why it's relevant to where we live here in the Connecticut River Valley, because the man who took these photos was Benjamin Kilbourne from Littleton, New Hampshire. And he had perfected with the advent of a special magnifying glass, had perfected these stereo views where you could look through the optics and you could see this 3D rendition. So what looks flat to us now, like this, with the special viewfinder, actually had depth to it. Now, Mr. Kilbourne, because this is had hooked up earlier with the people who had built the Rocks Estate. If you're not familiar with that history, the Glessners had a son, George, who was in this picture with his sister Fanny, who had hay fever. And they lived in Chicago. So I'm starting to see how the dots are connected here. And he bought a series of farms over in Bethlehem and stitched them together and created the Rocks Estate. And every summer he would come with his family, and George would get relief from his hay fever, being here in the clean mountain air. And so Glessner is a titan of industry in Chicago, and he was part of a group of farm families from Ohio that ultimately put together what we came to know as International Harvester for farm equipment. So there's a part of me that believes, and I haven't done a definitive research on Benjamin Kilbourne, that there is a connection there between taking pictures of the Glessner children at the Rocks Estate and getting the exclusive license for the Columbian Exposition to take these photos and sell these stereoptical images from the Columbian Exposition. And this is another one of Benjamin Kilbourne's famous photographs. And if you've not taken the COG, you might know that the experience is, a bucket list thing if you haven't done it. And there's a point on the trajectory of the incline where you can stand straight up, even though the train, the COG railroad, is on this pitch, but you're standing straight up and you won't fall forward or backward. You might fall off the sides, but you're not going to fall otherwise. And it's quite something to sort of stand out there and try to take photographs. I actually asked a photographer in Littleton to do that for me when I was doing some market copy writing for the COG Railroad, because that was just a little bit more beyond the experience I wanted to have with the COG. So on Cottage Street in Littleton is where the postcards, these stereoptic views were made. And that's a stereopticon. That's how you viewed it, and it's on a stand. So you could actually pick it up off that stand and hold it. All right, the opticals were designed by Oliver Wendell Holmes, this is quite the parlor thing. If you have, it's like having a Victrola in your living room. You would also have this as a sign of your education, your culture, that you've been around, and that you want to view these exotic photographs with this handheld device. So, there's competition, there's always competition. And there was too much competition in Germany, so Kurt Teich came here to the United States. And there's a sizable German population in Chicago, and that's where he wound up. Now, there are a couple of things I want to point out to you about this postcard, which really dates from the 1930s, which is a little bit after he's already established himself as the Kurt Teich Printing Company in Chicago. He had great quality about what he did. And what was happening as we progressed into the 20th century is several different technologies were transpiring. Notably, we had something that was created called rag paper. And I want you to think of this as something that soaks up the printer's ink. So these vivid colors that we see automatically tells us that we're looking at a linen postcard because the color saturation is so much brighter and so much denser because of the kind of paper that we're using. The other interesting thing about Kurt Tyke is that he employed, during the Depression, quite a number of artists who were out of work. And what he did is he gave them the task of creating these big balloon letter postcards, which is what these postcards are known by. So this is an amalgam of, let's see if I can do this, black and white pictures of the key buildings or sites in Chicago. And then they're painted. And then the letters are superimposed over these images, and then the images are superimposed over the postcard as a whole. And then they're reproduced on lithographic plates, and they're cranked out of machines by the thousands for sale to people who are visiting Chicago. In 1998, I was becoming so enamored of my postcard collecting that I drove across the country for a variety of reasons. And when you get to the Mississippi River, you can either go south to New Orleans or north to Chicago. And so I went to visit the Kurt Tyke Postcard Museum, which I highly, highly recommend. It's in Lake County, just southwest of Chicago, so you do need a car to get there. And eventually, the thousands and thousands, and he documented all the postcards that they produced. And so they wound up in this building that was built to house the collection. And you just go through these vast corridors where you have these postcards here. And what I learned, because you have to, if you want any access to do research, you have to make an appointment, and I did. And I saw original order forms for businesses that wanted Kurt Tyke Company to produce particular advertising cards. And what they would send a black and white photograph, and they would say, they would enumerate what they wanted removed from the image, so that whatever the message was, whatever the building you're looking at, or whatever the monument or the attraction is that you're looking at, that's the only thing that you're going to see, because everything else that's in that black and white photograph has been removed by brushstrokes from an artist. And it is, I highly recommend it. It's not on your average tourist destination, but if you are interested in any kind of graphic art whatsoever, what they have there is extraordinary. All right. So, of course, he has a rival. Not too far away in Detroit is this publishing company that was started by a man named Livingstone. Mr. Livingstone had a photographer that did some work for him, but eventually he hires this fellow, William Henry Jackson, who was born in Keysville, New York, but spent most of his childhood and teenage years in Rutland, working in a photographer's studio. Then he musters up for the Civil War, comes back from the Civil War, breaks off his engagement, and heads west. I don't know if he ever married again, but he had a really good eye for photography, and Livingston snapped him up to go work for him. Now, what you're looking at is a picture of the Hotel del Coronado in California that Jackson took, and he went all the way west for about 5 years, and was also working for the U.S. Geological Survey. So he gets his own train car, which has a developing studio in it. He has assistants and mules to carry all of his heavy equipment. So you see, if you look closely at the top, running this way is his tripod. This is his heavy camera that he has here, and glass plate negatives are probably in the other trunk beside there. And what Jackson is credited with is creating, among other things, Yellowstone National Park. The photographs, people would orally come back from the West and talk about the Rocky Mountains, the fountain pen pots, the petrified forests, and nobody really believed them back in Washington, D.C. But Jackson took photographs, and once you saw the photographs, you had proof of this amazing natural wealth that we had in this country, and the movement to preserve these international parks was undertaken with all this photographic evidence that Jackson came back with. So where does this come in for you, the collector, or you, the person with a camera taking pictures? Well, historically, over time, Christian missionaries would take pictures wherever they went. This is in Papua New Guinea, and this is in Senegal over here, of the natives that they were trying to Christianize, but they would also take pictures with them. So these have become valuable anthropological documents that we have of what these cultures were like at a moment in time before the white culture began to erase them. This is one half of a stereoptic view that Benjamin Kilbourne took of the Abenaki Indians selling their woven bowls at Echo Lake Park in Franconia. And this one's from my collection because I'm always interested in the people that are left out of mainstream history. And there are communities in New Jersey that are solely African American, and they've been this way for more than 100 years. And and this one, lawn size, just outside of Camden, New Jersey. And it's it's a standard, you get a postcard form like this, but you paste in a black and white photograph here. And this was a parade for a civic event that they were holding in town. And this was in the 1990s when the internet you could start to find people and send them email. And I actually found descendants of people who are in this photograph because I made a copy of it and I sent it to them. And they were able to identify at least 2 people that were in this car. But if this hadn't been saved and if this hadn't wound up in a postcard dealer's box of postcards about Greater Camden, New Jersey, we might never have seen these photographs. And so these become important artifacts of how any of us, the people who come before us, how they've lived. So going off on this tangent then, there's a category called real photo postcards. And one of my favorite photographers is William Harris, who set up shop on Lake Hopatcong. And this is his little Jack Russell Terrier named Hypo, who, and if you know anything about doing black and white negative development in the darkroom, there's something called Dectol, and there's another hypo fluid thing that you have to push all the paper through eventually until you get the full image. And so hypo was often pressed into service as a prop, particularly with children. And to help sell his postcards, Harris, or he had an assistant, would write these little witty things on the bottom, etched into the negatives that were intended to be humorous. So you could collect these postcards because they're William Harris. You could collect them because they're real photo postcards in black and white. Or you could collect them as a humor card just based on the expressions that you would find here. So those are 3 different ways you could, depending on what your predilection is, put your postcards into. Okay, so between the Spanish-American War and World War I, we had this proliferation of all the holidays that many of us probably have come to loathe celebrating, right? You know, you have to buy a card because it's Christmas, or it's Thanksgiving, or it's Easter, or it's New Year's, or it's the 4th of July, or it's Decoration Day, or it's you name it. And probably the one that's the biggest bonanza for businesses is Valentine's Day. So you could collect the sweet little sayings like this, okay, and have a nice collection of Valentine's cards. But there's a darker side, and these are called the vinegar Valentines. This is, so she's giving this guy the brush off here, and there's a whole subcategory of Valentine's postcards strictly with blowing off somebody you don't like. I had another one that I couldn't figure out a way to squeeze it in here because it was a horizontal and not a vertical, but it had the devil, and he was shooting arrows through people's hearts, that were hung up on a wash line. But you sort of get the idea, the vinegar Valentine. So there's a whole other category of this, and people are just passionate about finding them because it becomes something to be able to have as many of every different iteration there possibly could be of giving your lover the kiss off. So in this, I don't have mine with me, but I know the Athenaeum has a wonderful book of postcard views of Vermont. And I highly recommend you taking it out because it gives you another way of looking at Vermont's history. This is not Vermont, okay, this is a logging thing. Because of my family background in logging, I tend to collect these postcards. And what happened was The technology for cameras didn't exist at the time period of the stories I grew up with from my father, who grew up with them from the previous generation. So we never knew really what many of the trees looked like. But as you go further west into Wisconsin and then to the Pacific Northwest, the camera technology that allows you to go out into the woods and take these pictures becomes more easier to do. And they were, the Pacific Northwest and the California redwoods are notable in postcards because they just took thousands of pictures of them. And I can only try to imagine that this might be what our trees in northern New England might have looked like at one time. Harry Richardson is this fellow here in this postcard. Now, I grew up with this story about the beaver trout. How many of you have heard of it? No? No? Nobody? And you call yourselves Vermonters. Okay, so this was intended originally as a joke. And it was, I think it was a perch, and it was wrapped in some other fur from some other animal. And eventually, the fish went bad. It was tossed. But Harry Richardson, when he bought the Photocraft store in Newport, Vermont, thought that this could be a pretty funny come-on and a clever way to promote his business. And in this book on Vermont postcards, he's one of the only photographers that gets a serious amount of attention, because most of Vermont postcards were not, the photographers were not acknowledged. So there's a huge part of Vermont's photographic history that we don't know much about or have much of. And in fact, when Mr. Richardson passed in 1960, a lot of his negatives and postcards were thrown away. So what isn't, you can find at the Old Stone House Museum up in Brownington. And I would imagine, I haven't looked on eBay to find out what a Harry Richardson postcard was, what it's going for, but my guess is it's probably pretty high, because there's just not a lot of them. But he, this is a trout, and this is wrapped in beaver fur, and it's one of the most persistent myths that we have in Vermont, right up there with the Memphremagog monster and whatever's swimming around in Lake Champlain. But at least, somebody way back in about, I think the dates from about 1936, was trying to pull the public's leg, or at least all those Flatlanders. So another reason to collect postcards is because we want to know what used to be somewhere, what used to be on a location. And I've had a couple of house guests this summer, so I would take them to the French Quarter in St. Johnsbury, and I would invariably drive them down that street, I can't think of the name of it right now, between the Fairbanks Museum and the Green Church that they've bought. And I'd say, this was the French Quarter, and I'd say, and that was the French Hospital. You can see the trifold up there on the right-hand side in the skyline. And then we'd get to the parking lot, and I'd say, and this is where the church was. Whoops. So this is Notre Dame de Victoire, and it tragically burned in a fire, and it's now, the empty lot is a parking lot. This is right here. Do you know where this is? Pam Parker, where is this? Bottom of Eastern Avenue. Right? So this is Eastern Avenue here. And this is Railroad Street here. And this is the way the building used to look, with this little nice galleria here on the top, this balcony area, and that covered the portico, the front entrance to the hotel that was diagonally across from the train station. And I'm not wealthy enough to buy that building, but boy, I would love to see it restored to looking something like that. And Joan Weston, I put this one in here because I knew you were coming. And you're going to tell us where this covered bridge used to be over the Moose River in East St. Johnsbury.
It is, and burned in 1926.
Okay, so are we looking downriver or are we looking upriver?
Looks like there were waterfalls on the bridge.
Yep. Yes. I think.
It can't be.
So it's an interesting.
There's a building on the left, on the right, but I can't identify it.
So I'm not saying this about this particular image, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Joan, but what I have noticed in collecting postcards is that occasionally people, in the printing process, they would reverse the negatives. So this might not, in fact, be completely accurate, but it was the way that, from a compositional standpoint, it might have been a reverse negative. So it's if you drive down Route 2 today in East St. Johnsbury, it doesn't look quite like this. And of course, the covered bridge is gone from East Village Road. So we're about to enter World War I. Ink costs a lot of money. Printers don't want to waste their money running their images all the way to the border, to the edge, so the white border period begins. And this one is in Dave Cannell's collection, and it's notable for a couple of reasons. One, it's in the very early days still of when the Comerford Dam was built, and you get an idea of what the land used to look like. And the two, it was somebody bought this, a ham radio operator bought this and put his call letters on here so that you could find him. And he could, basically, it's so that anybody who found him on his ham radio, he could send them the card saying, this is where I'm from. And then they in turn become collectors of postcards from where they're communicating on their ham radios across the country and maybe even across the world. The thing about the white border postcards that's also notable is this was the huge era for F.W. Woolworth. These were cheap, and just about 7 years prior, the wire racks for being able to display postcards was invented. And so self-service, which is what F.W. Woolworth did, I mean, he upended the department store retail formula to let people actually pick up the product they were going to buy. You didn't have to ask a sales clerk for it. So he sold a lot of these postcards. And I remember going into Woolworth's buying them, and so does Leonard Lauder, who was buying them also starting from the age of 5 years old. But the paper isn't real sturdy, so they tend to disintegrate more easily, or they get bent, or they get worn out around the edges because the quality of paper isn't as good as it had been. And they were used for advertising. And this is just a collection of different kinds of advertising that you could find with the white border around it. Obviously, this is the precursor to Gorilla Glue in my mind. And the business owner is determined to use every inch available, trying to get his message out there, that you should buy his brand of glue. This, of course, was put out by the Ford Motor Company, and before we knew how bad cocaine was, this could numb your sore gums and teeth aches. So both Kurt Tyke and the Detroit Publishing Company, who are major players in the U.S. market, have a third competitor, and he's in Boston, and it's the Ticknor Brothers. Now, there hasn't been a lot, and when I was researching my book for Rutgers Press, I remember calling the Boston Public Library because I had found out they had a lot of Ticknor Brothers postcards, and nobody there could tell me anything about who these brothers were, not even their first names. But they were prolific, and they were printers. They weren't stationers. That their whole reason for being seems to be postcards and printing thousands of these. And they ultimately, because of their location in Boston, sort of edged out Detroit from the eastern seaboard market, and even Kurt Tyke to some degree, in terms of getting all the businesses, whether it was restaurants, hotels, even the New Jersey Turnpike produced postcards. So this used the big letter or balloon letter technique, is still in evidence. And you can sort of tell, the state flower? The arbutus, and the state capitol, Faneuil Hall, and so on and so forth. I lived in Boston for 5 years, and I don't remember what cranberries. And some of these, it would be, do show up as individual postcards. I was going to put one in with the cranberries here, growing on Cape Cod, but you know what that looks like. And what else?
Provincetown Monument in that picture has no safety grating around it. You know what you get to what now? There's
Oh,
iron fencing, so
Yeah.
the chat follow up.
Right. Well,
It's relatively new, so there's nothing.
yes, well, yeah, the good old days, right? So what Ticknor also had was a huge cache of negatives from the hurricane of 1938. They're recognized as probably the largest repository, which is now at the Boston Public Library, of negatives from the hurricane of 38. Photographers sent their stuff out, sent their stuff into Ticknor. Ticknor reproduced them and put them out as postcards. So this is, I think this is is this in Cambridge? Yes, this is in Cambridge, and this is down in the New London area, if I remember correctly, right? Yeah, okay. So this is how I learned about, there was a famous hurricane that blew up the coast of New Jersey, and I had never heard anybody talking about it until I started attending postcard shows, and I'd see this category for this hurricane, and I started collecting these. And the night and day difference of what this particular hurricane did just in New Jersey was extraordinary. And for some of the seaside resorts, they just never really financially recovered from them. So they are this documentation, it's almost sort of a photojournalism of what the wreckage can be. So where Ticknor started to take out the edge over Detroit and Kurt Tyke was during the Chrome era. Now, you've got the Eastman Kodak folks over in Rochester, New York, and they're trying to perfect they're getting away from glass plate negatives. They're improving the film technology. They even have cameras that will just take negatives for the size of 3x5 postcards. And they're trying with all their might. They even have a series called Ektachrome. If you've ever seen that on the back of the postcard, that refers to film that has a lot of blue in it. Okay, it didn't last for very long. I've shot with Ektachrome, and yeah, there's a lot of blue, and I don't see what the attraction is because it sort of takes away from the authenticity of the image that you're shooting. But you see that these are all intended for the travel and tourism market, right? This is Pennsylvania. We're hunting ducks or geese. We're over here in Arizona. This is Rockingham Park, the big racetrack in southern New Hampshire. And of course, this is the famous postcard that Bruce Springsteen put on his very first album. He walked into a souvenir stand on the Asbury Park Boardwalk. He was getting on a bus to go make a deal to cut an album. And this is what he chose to say this is where he was from. And so this has become iconic, but there are greetings from Asbury Park that go back to at least 1890. This whole greetings from idea has been around for quite some time, and it's to prove that you've been somewhere. Oops. So, this is Leonard Lauder, and I think that Bob went to see this exhibit, so really he's the man who should be talking about this. I was just moving up here in 2012 when it was taking place in Boston, so this completely escaped me, and I didn't go and see it. But I did get the book, and it's a wonderful book, and Leonard Lauder is the premier postcard collector in the United States. I think he's still alive, and he's widowed now, and we'll get to that in a minute. But unlike the Kurt Tyke Museum, right, where you're just sort of walking through this cave of postcards, these were all tastefully laid out in these and batted and mounted on walls. Hopefully, if you're not too short, you'd be able to see the top row. And it was in the Heinz Convention Center. This was like, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And Leonard ultimately donated a sizable portion of his collection to the Museum of Fine Arts. And I think what's really sweet is his wife, Evelyn, was a collector of photographs. So she liked the large format, as you see here, and her husband, from that childhood, 5 years old, and having a nickel to buy postcards of the Art Deco hotels in Miami Beach whenever they went there for the wintertime, both loved photography. They both loved it for different reasons and for different sizes. And it's quite extensive. I've seen photographs of his apartment where they're shallow drawers that are about the size of postcards, and it's like a buffet table, a buffet this high. And he would just pull out these drawers, and they're all cataloged, so he knows exactly what he has. He buys duplicates. I'm a big believer in doing that, because if you lose one, you always have the spare. And so he kept the ones he wanted to keep, and all the duplicates he gave to the Museum of Fine Arts. And he collects transportation, he collects other forms of art that are rendered in postcard size formats. And when his wife passed away in 2001, in this book that's about his collection, donated to the MFA in Boston, he dedicated it to his wife, Evelyn. And this is a postcard that's been blown up, and it's from the Exposition in Chicago, and it says, "Wish you were here." So this is the cover of my book. I realized I had a serious habit that I had to stop in terms of collecting postcards, but there are 18 of these little mosquitoes, and I was going to collect all 18 of them. I got as far as 4, and I had to cut myself off on that. But back in 10 years ago, I had a serious health crisis, and I really thought that I wasn't going to make it. And so I had my tombstone chiseled and put up in Riverside Cemetery. And it was, "Greetings from heaven, wish you were here." And so the only thing my family has to do when I die is put the death date in, and we're good. I've done all the other heavy lifting for them. But I realized that no matter all the other books that I've worked on, in which postcards have played a role when there's been no other photographic evidence of scenes and events that have happened, that this is something that is still with me. And I'm trying very hard not to collect anymore, because at one time I had a collection that was over 6,000 cards, and I donated all my Asbury Park postcards to Rutgers University. But I have a tote full of everything from New England, and I have another tote full of everything from my books, and so I'm not sure quite what I'm going to do with that. But that's the story in a nutshell in about 50 minutes. How did I do, Joan? So I could go on, and we don't have to look at this morbid picture if this, is disturbing. We could go back to something that's a lot more. Go back to St. Johnsbury coming up. That's kind of nice to look at in black and white. But there are a lot of different categories. There's a postcard show, I think it's every fall. It's over in Jefferson, New Hampshire. And I haven't been, because I've been working even on weekends. But this year, I made up my mind that I'm going to go and see what that's like. I've been to a postcard show over in Burlington, and it didn't quite excite me the way the postcard shows I've been to in New York City. When I used to come up here in the 90s after my father passed away, I found a huge dealer with a huge collection off the interstate somewhere in the deep forests of Massachusetts. So when I would leave the Northeast Kingdom and I'd go down 91, I'd hang a right somewhere in the Berkshires, and I'd go to his studio. He had a huge garage, and I called him up, I told him I was coming, and he obliged me, and I would just sit there and page through all of his postcards and then write him a check, and 2 hours later I'd get back on the highway and drive back to New Jersey. The Metropolitan Postcard Club in Manhattan is the oldest postcard club in the country, and they have a huge show every year in the New Yorker Hotel. And if you want to see the high rollers, that would be the show to go to. And as every collector knows, you try to get in good with the dealers beforehand, because really where all the buying and selling takes place among collectors is the night before the show opens. That's a real fact, and I think that probably happens in anything that has to do with antiquities. And I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, because I could go on, but I think I've said enough. So I will answer any questions you might have. Oh yes, all right, I'll tell you one more thing. Okay, so I'm part of the Waterford Historical Society, which we promote amongst ourselves anyway, as Vermont's newest Historical Society, or youngest rather, Historical Society. And I was intrigued by the fact that people had heard of Lower Waterford, which is really, once 93 went through in 1983, it's, you know, you don't even drive by it really anymore. And if you're not staying at the Rabbit Hill Inn, you're really not quite sure what Waterford, you know, what there is in Waterford. But it endures, and it endures mostly in the postcards of the Congregational Church from the era in which, before the trees grew up, and you could still see Moore Dam from Pucker Street. And so I started looking into this and got some help from the New England Ski Museum over in Franconia, and found out that Winston Pody, who is related by marriage to Guy Shorey, a famous photographer over in the Lancaster-Gorham area. And he had staked out Waterford, and Lower Waterford in particular, as the quintessential American rural village. And he had a contract with the American Greeting Card Company. And they printed these early postcards, and they printed these by the thousands. And the Rabbit Hill Motor Inn, if you remember, if any of you remember that era, would sell these, and you could buy these in gift shops here in St. Johnsbury and across the river in Littleton. And Lower Waterford became known because here's a photographer who finds a scenic view and sees its commercial potential and does all of this effectively pro bono marketing for this little rural village, you know, somewhere off now the interstate. And so we have a huge, it's an interesting, it must have been a large format of some kind. It's not a camera, but they had the image blown up. And it used to be in the St. Johnsbury House, when the St. Johnsbury House was a hotel. And when it was going to change of use, in the Waterford room, this huge photograph that looks like a painting, but it's not, was given to the town of Waterford, and they just hung it up over a fireplace in the basement of the second floor, the walkout area where the Davies Library is, and nobody knew anything about it. So now we finally, we dug through this, we wrote letters, we talked to people, and now we have something that tells anybody who looks at this enormous view about Winston Pody, this photographer from Lancaster, New Hampshire, who made a living strictly in his photography, strictly promoting the Americana. It's sort of like the post, oh God, it's the guy from the Berkshires who made all those Saturday Evening Posts, Norman Rockwell. So Pody was to the modern era with photography what Norman Rockwell was for illustrating the Saturday Evening Post. And so you find out all kinds of neat things. I'll stop. Really, I promise I will stop. All right, I'll tell you what, yes, go ahead, please.
So,
Stare at me.
stamp collectors are called philatelists.
Yes?
What are postcard collectors called?
Deltiologists.
Deltiologists.
Yes. Yes. Can you spell it? Is that what you asked? Yes. D as in David, E, L, T-I-O-L-O-G-I-Y. Deltiology. Yes. Yes. Chapter 7 in my book that I did for Rutgers was how to collect postcards. And I broke everything down using New Jersey postcards for all these different categories. Bob and I have talked about this, and I don't like to, the cautionary tale in postcard collecting is there's a huge market for anything that's Nazi related. And there are Jewish collectors out there who try to buy up whenever they hear about this to take it off the market so that it doesn't circulate. And there's also a huge underground market for anything of photographs of lynching of black men in the southern states.
And I was going to ask, surely there have been controversies about standards of decency for postcards being delivered by the USPS. Can you shed some light on that?
Not until recently. It was perfectly acceptable in the southern states to send those postcards, which is why they're circulating now, and why dealers find them and will sell them privately to collectors who are looking for that sort of thing. That sense of decency didn't extend. South of the Mason-Dixon line is a whole other culture here in this country.
But like pornography?
No, it wasn't considered pornography. The racism in this country, as you are quite aware of perhaps by now, with all this political stuff that goes on, is quite deep. So there's a lot of things that could be sent in the southern states through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and even northern Florida that nobody batted an eyelash at. It's horrible. I mean, but it is a part of our culture, and it is something to be at least aware of. But I didn't want to put it in this show because I really wanted this to be a little bit more cheerful. So I'll tell you another story. So when I was working for the Boston Herald, they sent me to Prince Edward Island, and I didn't have a car to rent. They wouldn't pay for that, but I'm stuck in Charlottetown, I think is the main drag, and I'm sort of walking around, and it's after dinner, and I'm bored, but I don't drink a whole lot, so I'm not going to go to a bar where I don't know anybody. So I go down this side street, and I see a light on, and it's an antique shop. And this is maybe about 7:30 in the evening, and so I rap on the window pane, and this big gray cat comes and looks in the window at me, and behind him is this big, even bigger man that comes over, and he peers at me, and I'm like, trying to look stupidly friendly. And so he opens the door and he growls at me, "What do you want?" And without missing a beat, I said, "I'm looking for the Morro Castle in Havana Harbor in Cuba." And that intrigued him. Now, in Asbury Park, New Jersey, the Morro Castle had been a packet boat, with mail that had become a cruise ship when you could go to Cuba, and it was sabotaged off the coast of New Jersey, and a lot of people lost their lives. And for about the entire winter, from September until the following March, all the rotting carcasses of the meat that was on board this ship stunk up Asbury Park. But I couldn't find a postcard. I really wanted this in my Asbury Park collection of what the real Morro Castle looked like, so that I could put it with this flaming cruise ship. And he was so intrigued by that quest that he let me in. And he turns on more lights, and he starts pulling out all of his postcard collections. And I sit down, and there's a way to sit and bend your knee and and be able to somehow multitask looking through boxes. They're like shoe boxes of postcards. So then like other people are walking by that know this guy, and they're surprised that he's open, so they come in, and all this, before you know it, we have a party going on looking for the Morro Castle in Havana Harbor. So every collector has these stories of meeting people and persuading people to let you take their picture or swap them coins or stamps, or create a dowry out of whatever you've got that's left over from your great aunt China. So I have a lot of these that revolve around postcard collecting, because it's just been a lot of fun, and it's given me something to do and kept me out of the bars. The 30s and 40s aren't worth a lot by comparison. What would make them valuable is their rarity. Okay, because all three companies produced a lot of postcards during the 30s and 40s. You can find a lot of them. So you might be paying $1, $2, $3, if you're a dealer trying to sell them and offload them. If they're in mint condition, not a scratch, not a tear, there's no soil of any kind, no human flop sweat on them, you might be able, if it's rare, if they know what the print run for that particular image was, they might try to get $10 from a buyer, for them. The real photo postcards, that's at the high end. So if you found a Harry Richardson postcard of Vermont, it tucked away, in your aunt's hope chest, let's say, and it doesn't exist at the Orleans County Historical Society, and it doesn't exist at the Vermont Historical Society Archives in Barry, either one of those organizations would probably pay dearly for those, and they could go up to hundreds of dollars worth for a little 3x5 mint condition, black and white, real photo postcard. That's at the top of the line. Yes?
State the obvious here. The internet obviously has done a number on postcards. And in my travels, especially going through some, less economically developed countries, and at times looking for postcards to send to friends, whatever, I get the impression that, the ones I'm looking at, they've been around for years, and people are just trying to, make their last penny off.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you can still get them around here, but I'm just wondering, if you can provide any insight into the state of the postcard world nowadays.
Well, the internet and selfies, have taken a real hit. A finely crafted postcard, if you were to stand and, try to take a picture today, you as the photographer, you're waiting for the right time of day, for the daylight. You're waiting for the least amount of traffic, usually, unless traffic is integral to the story you're trying to tell in that postcard. And most people, because of the proliferation of cell phones, just don't appreciate the craft that goes into that. I mean, I have a friend here whose brother's a very well-decorated photographer in Danville, and there are a lot of, they won't do wedding. I don't think Matt does weddings, does he? No, because too many people in weddings just think that they can take the picture, and that will be fine. But 15 years from now, it won't be. And so, there's a real economic issue at work here with these pictures, because people don't, with cell phones, really know how to take them. I did this workshop for the Vermont Story Lab in Montpelier, and the woman who preceded me works for VPR and was talking about how to take pictures with cell phones. And this was for the audience was people working in the nonprofit sector. And I got up afterwards and I said, "This is how. Here's my camera. Here's how you take a real picture, because you know that the photographs that you're taking have to appear on an appeal letter, on an annual report, and the pictures you take with cell phones will not last long enough, and they degrade in the reproduction of them." So they're as much as there are people who are enthusiastic about photography and do a really good job, with it, and do win awards like Matt Pyer does, are outnumbered by the amateur photographers who think they're doing just fine putting something on, Instagram. And it's fleeting. That's the thing. Postcards were, and the collections that Bob has here at the Athenaeum, the postcards are in these beautiful albums. And if you know how to tell a story with photographs, you can sequence an entire story, right? It's like a form of storyboarding. And so I think that if people go out and they talk about this, they share their craft with other people, they help people understand the subtleties of what goes into taking these pictures, just even the balloon letters, the fact that you have somebody who by hand, was painting over black and white photographs to create that image is incredibly labor intensive, and it provided somebody with a job. Just like the whole locavore movement, we're providing farmers with jobs, right? We buy their produce. Well, it's the same thing if you're going to buy, a piece of art. But yeah, I agree with you. It's very hard to find new postcards. I occasionally go into Petticoat Junction, down there on Route 2 and 18, and just look to see. But I'm looking for something, I'm also kind of picky. I'm looking for something that's a little bit, it's like, where's the new Vermont? Where's the new rural Vermont postcard that I could send back to New Jersey and make everybody envious that I live here and they don't? That isn't the black and white Guernsey. So, there's a challenge there in doing that, and there's a challenge there, I think, for photographers to figure out if there's any money to be made at it, from it. Well, thank you very much. And I hope to come back next April with something new.